What is dopamine? Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a critical role in sending signals of motivating behavior. It gets released when we take a bite of delicious food, when we have sex, after we exercise, and even when we have successful social interaction. From an evolutionary perspective, one would say it rewards us for beneficial behavior and motivates us to repeat them. Structure. One dopamine neurotransmitter is made of a benzene ring with 2 hydroxyl side groups attached to one amine group. Dopamine is a catecholamine transmitter in the brain. What are catecholamines? Catecholamines are made in the adrenal glands, which are small hormone production factories that sit just on top of our kidneys. There are 3 main types of catecholamines: dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Describe how dopamine is made, trafficked, stored, and recycled. Dopamine is synthesized in a series of enzymatic reactions beginning with the amino acid tyrosine. This synthesis takes place in both the cytoplasm and in enzyme-containing vesicles of neural cells. After our brains produce dopamine, the neurotransmitter is packed into a synaptic vesicle, vascular monoamine transporter 2, VMAT2, and stored until action potentials induce the release of dopamine into the synapse, thus causing it to bind to dopamine receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Is dopamine neuron-specific? What part of the brain and which cells do you find it in? Dopamine is neuron-specific, as it is only produced in dopaminergic neurons. The dopamine found in the basal ganglia plays a major role in the way our brains control our movements, and the lack of it may result in several disorders, which we will discuss later on in this video. In the frontal lobes, dopamine plays a critical role in controlling the flow of information from areas of the brain. Dopamine disorders in the frontal lobes can cause a decline in neurocognitive functions, particularly those linked to the frontal lobes, such as memory, attention, and problem solving. In addition, dopamine is involved in the chemistry of pleasure. Release of dopamine into part of the limbic system known as the pleasure center, an area that lies just below the thalamus, causes pleasure. Although it functions normally to reward vital activities such as eating and sex, the same mechanism is also responsible for the craving connected with addiction to drugs, cocaine for example.
There are 5 types of dopamine receptors: D1, D2, D3, D4, and D5. We can categorize dopamine receptors in 2 main subtypes. D1-like receptor family. The GS protein is involved and adenylyl cyclase would be activated. The action of the enzyme causes the conversion of adenosine triphosphate to cyclic adenosine monophosphate. D2-like receptor family, which is the receptor combining the GI protein and its activated alpha subunits, then inhibits adenylyl cyclase so that the concentration of the cAMP is reduced. The D1 and D5 receptors are closely related and couple to GS-alpha and simulate adenylyl cyclase activity. In contrast, the D2, D3, and D4 receptors couple to GI-alpha and inhibit the formation of the cAMP. And this is a model of how the D1 dopamine receptor looks like. This picture demonstrates the structure of the dopamine receptors in the brain. Within the central nervous system, dopamine binds to its receptors presented by neurons, and it plays a key role in the control of locomotion, learning, working memory, cognition, and emotion. Physiological functions of the brain dopamine system are well recognized. However, dopamine biosynthesis does not only occur in neurons, but also in the peripheral tissues. Dopamine receptors have been described in the kidney, pancreas, lungs, and in numerous blood vessels outside the central nervous system.
So, what are the diseases associated with dopamine? First, schizophrenia. In schizophrenia, dopamine is tied to hallucinations and delusions. That's because brain areas that run on dopamine may become overactive, and antipsychotic drugs can stop it. Parkinson's disease is another disease that has association with dopamine. In Parkinson's disease, neurons of the substantia nigra progressively degenerate. As a result, the amount of dopamine available for neuron transmission in the corpus striatum is lowered. The biochemical imbalance manifests with typical clinical symptoms, including resting tremor and rigid movement. Can drugs also affect the way dopamine works? Definitely. First, let's talk about cocaine. Cocaine targets the mesolimbic dopamine system, which is the brain's reward pathway, by binding to dopamine transporters, blocking the removal of dopamine from the synapses. This causes neurons to release abnormally high amount of dopamine, creating the sense of high. The drug's ability to rapidly release high levels of dopamine in reward areas of the brain strongly reinforces drug-taking behavior, making the user want to repeat the experience. Another drug, methamphetamine or meth, also increases the amount of the natural chemical dopamine in the brain by inhibiting the uptake of dopamine. One high-affinity target of meth is the sigma-1 receptor. The sigma-1 receptor is a ligand-gated chaperone protein that, upon activation, translocates to various cellular compartments of endoplasmic reticulum, where it is thought to affect protein folding, ion channel, and G-protein couple receptor functions. The short-term effects include increased wakefulness and physical activity, decreased appetite, faster breathing, rapid and/or irregular heartbeats, increased blood pressure, and body temperature. In the long term, it causes damage to the brain's dopamine system that are associated with reduced coordination and impaired verbal learning. Another drug, levodopa or L-Dopa, is a drug used to treat Parkinson's disease. Symptoms of Parkinson's disease start to show up when dopamine-producing cells in the brain die. L-Dopa, a precursor chemical to dopamine, helps to boost dopamine levels in the brain. Once L-Dopa reaches the brain, it transforms into dopamine. Therefore, L-Dopa is used as a dopamine replacement agent for the treatment of Parkinson's disease. There are also other categories of drugs, for example, dopamine agonists. Dopamine agonists are a class of drugs that bind to and activate dopamine receptors in the brain. They mimic the action of naturally occurring dopamine in the brain, causing the neurons to react as they would to dopamine. There are also dopamine antagonists. Dopamine antagonists are a class of drugs that bind to and block dopamine receptors. Dopamine antagonists turn down dopamine activities, which may be useful for the treatment of psychiatric conditions such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which have been associated with an overactive dopamine system. So, this is all about dopamine. I hope you enjoyed the video.